Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cannabis 360 panel on the path to EU GMP certification. My name is Vicky. I work as a Quality Assurance and Regulatory Affairs Consultant at AAPS, and I will be the moderator for this discussion. I'm very excited to have Deepak and Lucas joining us today. Before we get the discussion started, maybe we can get a brief introduction from both of you. Deepak, we can start with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate you putting on this event. I'm Deepak Anand. My position currently is CEO of Materia. Been around in the cannabis space for just over 7 to 8 years now. Worked with a number of different licensed producers in Canada as well as international governments, and have done quite a bit of work around EU GMP. So very much looking forward to the conversation, and thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. Lucas?
Yeah, I'm Lucas McCann. I'm CSO and co-founder of CAnnDelta. We're a regulatory and scientific cannabis and psychedelics consulting firm based in Toronto. My claim to fame is I hold a PhD in medicinal organic chemistry, and I worked within a quality lab at Health Canada's health products branch. So I largely assist folks with licensing, compliance, ongoing regulatory support for both cannabis and the psychedelic sector in Canada and beyond.
Thank you so much. So EU GMP is undeniably a very hot topic among Canadian cannabis license holders. In fact, some companies in Canada have gone to great lengths to obtain it. So I believe this discussion is a great opportunity to explore this subject more and also address some questions and concerns. So Lucas, let's start with you. Can you provide us just a brief overview of what EU GMP certification is and why it is such an important part of the international cannabis market?
Sure. So we'll start by defining GMP, which is good manufacturing practices. That's a set of minimum standards for quality management, and the quality management will ensure that we have a consistency of production processes of particular products, and that we have appropriate controls in place to ensure safety of consumers. We largely see this across the pharmaceutical industry, though it applies to food and cosmetics and also cannabis. So the steps of manufacturing, processing, handling, packaging, product release, storage, and even advertising, marketing authorizations are all part of this. So it's a lot more than just continuous monitoring of environmental conditions of production areas in which drugs are manufactured and sealed. It also includes a big component of operating procedures that must be followed and the documentation that these procedures have been followed when products are being produced. So it's very prescriptive, and it establishes that the products are going to be appropriate, meaning that they're going to be safe for its intended use. To export cannabis from Canada, some countries require that cannabis be produced under GMP conditions, and if those countries are in Europe, you can expect it'll be EU GMP conditions that product will have to be produced under. So there's an organization called the EMA in the EU called the, more specifically, the European Medicines Agency. So the EMA, which is the European Union regulated body, very akin to Health Canada, has the guidelines on GACP, or Good Agricultural Collection Practices, for starting material of herbal origin. Okay, so what that means is that they've basically set the bar and are in control of the medicinal herbal substances for which cannabis can be classified. So the EMA harmonizes GMP activities across the EU level, and that's where we get the term EU GMP. So going back to some of the core principles of GMP, and it's very important to establish this because this will likely be the crux of many of the aspects we'll be referring to throughout today's panel. It involves a mix of a few things. So validation, stability for products, as well as facility, personnel, and even the way a building has been constructed and the equipment, its intended use, and how that's been established and implemented. So validation means that everything that you say that you're going to do, that you actually do it. That can mean anything from providing a high level of assurance that a process works, equipment is being used, all the way down to saying that a sanitizer that you're using for particular equipment is actually going to kill bacteria, mold, mildew, and other pathogens that could exist. So you have to prove that. Stability is an important part. Stability speaks to the amount of an API that will exist in a pharmaceutical product over time as it's exposed to different environmental conditions. And the last piece, again, is the facility and the personnel within that facility. So it requires a coherence between everyone from the custodian to the chief executive officer within a facility, all with a strong commitment to compliance. So the guidelines have been developed to ensure safe and good quality products by identifying what has to happen in certain production steps. So again, we've spoken to personnel, building and facilities, equipment. Documentation is very important, and we have a saying in the industry that if it doesn't exist in documentation, it never happened. You have to be able to prove everything with a paper trail. Quality assurance is important. Seeds and propagation material, cultivation, collection, harvest, processing, packaging, and again, storage and distribution are all important aspects. So GMP medicines require that that they are consistent of high quality, they're appropriate for their intended use, and again, they meet the marketing requirements and have the proper clinical trial authorization. So why do we have GMP? This is a good question. The reason that we have any standard in the industry, and largely why we have science principles and hypotheses, all stems from usually a similar incident resulting from a large failure, a catastrophe. We saw similar things happen in the history of development of EU GMP. So there's some infamous stories that get taught when GMP is being introduced in an academic setting. One of the most important, I think, is the inclusion of certain nefarious chemicals used to dissolve APIs. So one thing about drugs is that they're typically very insoluble in compounds such as water. So for people to make these elixirs or tonics, they would have to dissolve them in organic solvents. There was one example of DEG being used, which is diethylene glycol, or effectively antifreeze, which works extremely well at dissolving pharmaceutical ingredients because of its lipophilic nature. The issue with that, though, is that humans don't do very well at digesting organic solvents. So what was supposed to be used as a medicine ended up killing a lot of people. There are also other examples of things that have been established across North America as well, and there's been a few countries that have worked together to establish their own sort of levels of GMP. We have like an FDA GMP in the US, and EU GMP is very parallel to that in a lot of ways. Another interesting example was there was a publication called The Jungle, which was largely supposed to be a report on labor conditions in slaughterhouses. It was written by Upton Sinclair. And even though the labor issues were largely ignored, what was paid attention to were the filthy conditions that meat within the slaughterhouses was being stored within, how it was being adulterated with various chemicals, and that product was again being sold and consumed. So once this report came out, unfortunately, it didn't hit the mark with the labor unions, but it did hit the mark to establish in 1906 what we call the Pure Food and Drug Act, which is largely a truth in labeling act. From there, we saw several iterations and improvements and changes to GMP. Canada was actually on the radar for helping with contributing to GMP standards in the late 50s when they were producing medical products for use in the military. And then finally, in 1992, we established EU GMP a lot more formally, as countries were responsible for ensuring compliance in their own national authority from then on. And then, when EU GMP came into place, we had emerging markets, and the EMA came in to again assist with that. So again, largely to summarize, it's a ton of well-written procedures, ensuring that those procedures are followed all the way to the point of having documentation to trace that, and that the storage, packaging, and production and advertising of those compounds all follow this standard. So getting back to the last part of your question is, why is EU GMP important if we want to, for example, acquire access to certain markets? There is a lot of money that can be invested to making a facility in Canada meet EU GMP standards, and in the Canadian cannabis industry, we follow GPP for a licensing standard. And GPP, some people will say, is not necessarily to the same level as GMP, but in many ways it's different. So in GPP, every batch, every lot has to be tested. In EU GMP standards, once you validated that testing can be done, or once you validated a certain process works, you're not required to test every time. So finding a harmonization takes resources, and it takes resources from the beginning of an inception of a building. So a lot of the clients that we work with have a desire to implement EU GMP until they learn about the cost, and the cost is in many cases prohibitively expensive for startup businesses.
Thank you. That was very informative. And Materia recently obtained its EU GMP certification. Congratulations on that. That's a huge accomplishment. Also, congratulations on the acquisition of Materia by Cannabis Group. That's another milestone. So, Deepak, based on your experience, how difficult is it to actually get the EU GMP certificate? How long would you say that it takes from the beginning to the end? And maybe you can just give us some unforeseen challenges during the process.
Sure, very happy to. Thanks for that kind of sort of question and also background. So I'll just get into answering some of your specific questions. But one of the things that I wanted to cover was the question around why does Canada not have GMP on cannabis? And I think it's a very important aspect also to cover. I mean, so just to add to sort of the previous question and comments that Lucas was providing, there's something called the Mutual Recognition Agreement that's signed by, a number of countries, and Canada is certainly a signatory to that. So if pharmaceutical product, as an example, that's manufactured in Canada under GMP conditions in Canada would be acceptable overseas, including Europe. The reason that, cannabis is a little bit outside of that or different from that is, as Lucas mentioned, we operate to GPP standards, and that's because the regulatory structure in Canada is very different. Not that the Canadian sort of Health Canada protocols aren't up to speed, because on the pharmaceutical side, it's identical. So I wanted to mention that first at the outset. In addition to that, so sort of to directly answer some of your questions in terms of how to go about GMP and sort of what are some of the common mistakes. I think that GMP is just a mindset, and you need to be able to make sure that your team and your group fully understands why you're operating to that mindset. It's all about operating in principle on a compliance basis, and your team needs to be dedicated towards that. And it's not just your quality assurance team; it's a number of other production teams, number of commercial teams in many cases that need to have that same commitment. And I think what's happening in Canada, and Lucas kind of briefly touched on this a little bit, was you're seeing operators currently want to get GMP standards, but also have a business to run. And that business to run is around Canadian products and putting Canadian products onto the market in Canada. And because you don't need the GMP standards, and because costs are so prohibitive, as Lucas was saying, to be able to adhere to standards, in many cases might not make sense. But when I was talking to people around, and when I got asked around EU GMP, particularly in Canada, my first question back to them is why do you want to get EU GMP? What's the rationale? And if the rationale is, we just want to operate at higher quality, there's a lot that you can do on the GPP side to make sure they're operating to that quality. Then the question comes around the commercials. And surprise, on the commercial side too, you're not talking about significant ROI in terms of, you're going to be able to get $12 a gram for your product. Those days have far surpassed us. And so I think businesses that are currently looking at GMP today really need to ask themselves the question, why do we want to have GMP? And I can answer your question on the Materia side. We've had sort of, the sort of fortunate or unfortunate roadmap to go by. We've had a rear view mirror in terms of hindsight to look at and see what's worked in Canada and what hasn't. And what we on a global basis is that there are a number of cultivators, not only in Canada, but across the world now, that are cultivating high quality product at a very cheap price. The challenge that they have and they find themselves in is then trying to get that product into the European market. So Materia is not a cultivator. What we do is we allow companies to be able to bring product through our facility in Malta, package it, process it, and then sort of, ship it under EU GMP conditions. And we're able to launch these products into European markets. We have, many distribution agreements in place with some Canadian licensed producers in the German market, and we have a full distribution network in Germany. So we distribute these products. So those were some of the sort of, questions that you answered. Typically, the other thing I would say is, there's the cost element, which we covered, but then there's also the time element. And it's very important to understand from the time that you get up, you get set, your facility is built, your production standards have been validated, you've gone through the processes, you're still looking at a fairly extensive period of time. It took us over 2 years to be able to get our EU GMP certification from the time that we started. And I think the average time in the industry is closer to that time period, anywhere from a year and a half to 2 years. COVID, of course, has accelerated that now because you're dependent on regulators actually coming and traveling overseas. So I think cost and time are two very important things to keep in mind when you're considering EU GMP.
Yeah, if I could build on that as
Absolutely.
well. There's some great points that you mentioned. I mean, whenever we're having that conversation with clients, obviously, like, why do you want EU GMP is an important fundamental question to respond to. And I think many clients that I've spoken to, or prospective clients, have been in the conversation, well, we just want to be the best. And I remember being a 6-year-old sitting around the dinner table with my parents, and they said, you know, the PhD is the highest level of education, without me understanding sort of what that meant and what I was committing to at the time. Said, oh, okay, well, that's what I want to go and do as well, without actually realizing that that led me to 13 years of university and academic experience. So that, I think, is very important to highlight, that people come in very ambitious, and when they're putting together pitch decks about what their business could look like, having that EU GMP is very much an icing on the cake. But it's also important to remember that if we're looking at the number of EU GMP certified licensed producers that we have in Canada, you can basically count those on one hand. So that's out of a total of we're over 550 licensed producers that are focused on cultivation in Canada. So very, very few, right? Less than 1% are actually at that standard as well. So whenever clients are talking about that, you always have to have a conversation about what their budget looks like in terms of getting operational, talking about timelines for ROI, and the time like it's going to take from, for example, when they begin working with us to the time that they make their first dollar can sometimes be 6 months to a year, easy from a licensing standpoint. And then if their business model depends on the EU GMP, we say this is a multi-year process, leave it open-ended, but usually infer that it's going to be about 2 years of bad luck that they'll be experiencing as they're working towards that. And another challenge is that the folks that are largely coming into cannabis don't have the pharmaceutical background, they don't have the food background. They're coming from maybe other tangential sectors, regulated sectors, sometimes oil and gas, and they don't have the sort of the understanding of what it means to harmonize everything in a facility to meet that EU GMP. Another big challenge there is coming into a facility that's already built. The easiest way to obtain this certification is to have this in mind throughout construction, throughout your process flow, and even all the way up into through hiring and selecting the personnel that will work there. Retrofitting a facility that already exists to satisfy EU GMP is going to be very, very expensive, and it's going to be, again, very cost prohibitive. So again, dividing into the nuances of validation and stability studies and writing these procedures, again, becomes not just the biggest crux. I think it's the understanding that this is, in some cases, a very complex harmonization of a lot of things that have to come together. Impacted also by the fact that, getting folks to audit you and to fly over here and help with that certification is going to be increasingly difficult, considering the situation that we're in for public health.
Couldn't agree more. Deepak, just to reference back to Malta, as you mentioned before, what would you say that makes regulations in Malta unique? Do you consider them to be pretty flexible? Or not really?
So, Malta was, is probably right after the German regulator, the regulator that's done the most other inspections of facilities on a global basis, cannabis facilities, that is. They've now awarded certification to facilities in Israel. They've awarded certification to facilities in Canada, including some very large LPs in Canada. There's, that's sort of what's on the public side. There's a number of inspections that they've conducted and continue to conduct that aren't actually sort of public yet. So they certainly have a high degree of experience with GMP as well as with cannabis, and they've intentionally done that. The government has made it a mandate on their side to be able to ensure that cannabis is going to be a successful industry within the island, and they've had a track record of embracing businesses and bringing them on, particularly businesses that haven't been regulated before. And so I think what Malta offers is a unique opportunity and a regulator has been very, very welcome to work with. It's been an absolute pleasure working with them. When you contrast sort of how things are done here in Canada, as an example, in the responsiveness from Health Canada, as opposed to the responsiveness from the Malta Medicines Authority. More specifically, the cannabis, Malta is one of sort of only 2 jurisdictions on a global basis that allows for a non-GMP product to be brought in for further processing, packaging, and then distribution, subject to you meeting a number of conditions. I think one of the biggest myths out there is that you somehow bring non-GMP product into Malta and may wave a magic wand and then you're able to get the product out. There's actually quite a complex set of processes that go in the quality aspect in making sure that you're qualifying your suppliers to be able to ensure that they're complying with basic standards before you can bring product in. But nonetheless, there is the ability for companies that want to go through the whole quality assurance process to be able to bring product into Malta and then basically package it or distribute it and send it out from there. So that regulatory nuance has been certainly an interesting one, and we've explored that, we've brought in product in, and we look forward to building on that.
Amazing, thank you. Lucas, going back at you, can you give us just a high-level overview of the current European market, and how would you potentially see that transforming into 2022? Like any areas that you think they will significantly grow, or some areas that you would like to see growing?
Sure. So there are 4 countries that are worth highlighting in our current snapshot of the European market. So Germany, Italy, Netherlands, and the UK, with Germany being the VIP on the list. Germany, as many know, is the largest importer of medical cannabis. The combination of both the medical and the illicit market within Germany or Western Europe is predicted to be on the order of about 10 billion euros, I'd say. So it's very considerable. With the German parliamentary elections also occurring at the end of September, next month, I believe September 26th, there is the belief that there's a strong possibility that adult use cannabis will be legalized and the regulations will exist by 2025. So that will largely slow down the growth of medical cannabis, as we've seen in Canada with the regulations moving past the ACMPR to the Cannabis Act and the corresponding cannabis regulations as well. So it's going to be heavily influenced by the election. So it's going to be exciting to stay tuned, in the next couple of weeks to see how that's going to play out. And if the political party is in favor of legalization, probably about 4 years later, towards the second half of the legislative period there, we would expect regulations to roll out there as well. That would open up new opportunities for new tax income, such as VAT, but also excise duty like tobacco. And again, Germany's export-oriented market will be able to tap into a relatively new industry and utilize technologies where companies could expand their knowledge and begin exporting their products. Next, I would mention Italy. Italy is next in line, in my opinion. It's the second largest medical cannabis market. So currently, they're consuming approximately 1.2 tons of medical cannabis. Their medical community, their medical patients of folks using medical cannabis is significantly smaller than Germany. It's 20,000 versus the 120,000, approximately 100 to 120,000 that exist in Germany. So it's relatively smaller. But Italy has a medical cannabis framework with private pharmacy wholesalers who import medical cannabis products produced by Bedrocan in the Netherlands. So that's definitely contributed to the growth of Italy's cannabis market. Private wholesale accounts for about 59% of medical cannabis during the year, 25% from military pharmaceutical chemical plant, and 19% roughly from hospital pharmacies. So interestingly enough, as we move as a leader in Canada in adult use cannabis and having created a medical framework over the past couple decades within Canada, that has triggered and catalyzed growth of other healthcare professionals in the sector, especially in Europe and Italy specifically, that are now more open to learning about the benefits of medical cannabis as a replacement to prescribing other, sometimes more nefarious compounds, opioids certainly being one of those as well. Next to that, I'd mention the Netherlands very quickly. Again, Netherlands has Bedrocan, which is selling off its entire harvest to the Office of Medical Cannabis. And then the UK is one to definitely keep our eyes open for cannabis-based products for medicinal use, so CBPMs. So the use of cannabis based medicine in the UK is unfortunately very limited. So they have a medical framework that's in place. So seeing this open up so that patients can acquire access, I think would be fantastic. It's been very difficult for patients that have prescriptions for cannabis in the UK to be able to access that. And what we've learned from seeing what happens in the UK is that, actually very similar to Canada, is that most of the folks are self-prescribing with cannabis products that they're accessing from the illicit market. So across the whole, I would expect to see big changes in Germany with a new framework opening up there, and hopefully across the board, medical practitioners that are responsible for prescribing alternate forms of medicine begin to much more largely consider medical cannabis as a viable form of medicine.
Perfect. Thank you. Lots of opportunities. Deepak, just to change a little bit the question, do you see any countries that they're still far behind in terms of cannabis in Europe?
Yeah, look, generally I'd say, Europe is far behind, particularly when you look at it from a North American perspective. Even Germany, which is the most mature market in Europe, still has a long ways to go. I mean, we've seen the market predominantly be flower and continue to grow in the flower category. Now you're starting to see things like oils kind of pick up steam, but we're far away from, the typical dosage products. And that's because of a number of different kind of regulatory requirements, why you haven't seen soft gels as an example in the market, or capsules or tablets or tinctures or topicals like you would see in North America. So generally the market has a long ways to go and a long ways to evolve. But, I think more specifically, certain areas of Europe, absolutely. There's countries like France, Switzerland, Czech Republic, Spain, that haven't even come on stream from a meaningful perspective with respect to their medical cannabis legislation. France has introduced a trial program for the next couple of years, but it's said to be the largest market, will be the largest market of medical cannabis in Europe once it comes fully on stream. So we haven't even started to scratch the surface yet. And there's a number of European countries that still need to come on. I think the big question is really around harmonization. And I think this is a conversation that's been live on the European basis, is because Europe operates as a bloc, and typically there's the European Union, there's member states within it. They still don't have a harmonized policy on medical cannabis. It's still illegal in some countries within the European Union, in fact. So there's a long ways to go from the time that you get to full-blown harmonization. Harmonization, for those that might not know, means that if I'm a citizen in France or a citizen in Malta or a citizen in Germany, I should have identical healthcare coverage to the same products in each of those jurisdictions. And so we're far away from harmonization on that. We're also far away from harmonization even agreeing to a monograph, for example, on flowers. So there's still a long ways to go on where this is going. But nonetheless, I think one thing that's probably common throughout the whole theme is that the market is going to be significant and is going to be quite large once a lot of these countries come online. It just might take some time to get there.
So we're usually talking about import, but what about domestic production, like producing their product for their own use without importing cannabis from other international markets? How far are we from?
Yeah, so
Sorry.
Germany
Go
just
ahead.
got its first harvest come on stream very recently, and we saw those products being launched into the market. The challenge is that German government had put on a tender, 3.5 years ago now, and we're starting to see the first product hit the market. Within that tender, there was a limited number of lots of products that were actually awarded and allowed to be cultivated. So there's a restriction on what sorts of products that you can actually cultivate in terms of the CBD and THC breakdown. Even assuming all of that cultivation that was approved in that tender was to come on stream, and given where consumption and demand is in the German market, there's still a negative deficit in the sense that you would still have to import product to be able to meet demand. So we're not there yet with respect to cultivation. And I think generally what we're seeing now on a global basis is there's no longer this need to cultivate cannabis within country. I think, 5 years ago, that was a very different story when Canada was just trying to get off its feet. But since then, you start to see Colombia, Portugal, Uruguay, a variety of other countries started to really pick up the cultivation game. So, I think that if you're talking about recreational, and I think this is where there's going to be a real differentiation is, are you talking about cultivation of recreational cannabis, or are you talking about cultivation of medical cannabis? As far as medical cannabis is concerned, I see Europe, over the medium to long term, not having product cultivated domestically, but actually importing product and then perhaps doing things like we're doing in Malta, which is either processing or even further manufacturing, or even beyond that, producing specific delivery systems. I think that's where the future is in terms of where Europe is going to be doing things with cannabis, as opposed to trying to cultivate product in country. Recreational cannabis, however, is a whole different kettle of fish. And I think as Lucas was alluding to, I think certainly a lot of decisions that are going to be made in Germany, and we'll be watching that very closely. But decisions have already been made in Luxembourg and Switzerland, where they're already proceeding forward with the recreational program. And I think those products will be cultivated, will have to be cultivated domestically because of UN treaties and sort of where those things currently sit.
That's a good point. Deepak, would you say that the European level of harmonization is akin to what they have in the US at a state level?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. That's a great way of putting it. Yeah,
it's a very fractured system that we have in the U.S., where product can't move across state lines, and it doesn't seem like it's much different in the EU right now. With you go one direction 100 kilometers, and you're in a country like France, which has very, very strict regulations surrounding cannabis use. Compared to a country that's very close by like Germany.
Yeah.
And Lucas, what is your opinion about using countries like as an import base, but they have a better climate, such as Uruguay, for example? Germany started accepting products from Uruguay. So would you see that the market would actually start turning into getting more products from these countries, or using these countries or like a growing basis because of the climate?
It's a good question. I mean, it's kind of a two-part question. There are a few concerns that you need to highlight when you're talking about warmer climates, because that's normally signaling that you're talking about outdoor cultivation. And outdoor cultivation obviously has its own nuances that one must be aware of. Certainly, you lack the controls that you would have in an indoor situation, in an indoor facility where environmental control is established for temperature, humidity, light exposure, and all of that can be a very important concern when we're talking about importing products into the EU as well. But from that side, there definitely would be a huge shift from a climate change perspective, because I'm not sure if folks are familiar with Tom Ulanowski's presentation that he made on the efficiency, the energy efficiency of growing cannabis. And to be brief, it's very much not an efficient process whatsoever if we're talking about controls that happen in indoor cultivation or climate-controlled greenhouses. So it is a bit of a double-edged sword there, but it certainly can be a huge disruptor if that is going to be the case. But there are definitely some big concerns that I think would need to be mitigated there. So Latin America, I know, has a few countries that have passed legislation to allow cannabis production and use. The Caribbean, Antigua, Barbuda, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines are positioned to become viable exporters. South Africa is potentially shaping up to be a viable exporter for medical cannabis, and Lesotho as well. We know that there's a framework there, but again, we run into that same issue of ensuring that the products that are being imported, specifically if they're coming into the EU in the medical cannabis framework, are going to adhere to the tougher restrictions and requirements that might not necessarily be implemented in those regimes also. So it's hard to say for now, but if those companies certainly can satisfy the requirements and the regulations for EU GMP certification, then certainly they could be a strong contender.
Thank you. And Deepak, do you?
I'd also just like to add. I'd just like to add something to that, if that's okay. One of the things that I like to say is I think it's very important for us to step back. And I think when we talk about cannabis, we typically look at it from very unique lenses and very sort of geographically limiting lenses. What we call cannabis in Canada is very different than the way term cannabis that we used in Europe or in India, as an example, because in Canada, everything that is under cannabis is captured, including CBD. And so CBD is regulated identically to the way THC is. And so if you're cultivating cannabis in Canada, it applies to everything. But I think we need to step back and look at this from a global basis and actually really slice and dice it out, because I think what you were trying to get to is, does it make sense to have outdoor cultivation? Yes, if you're doing outdoor cultivation of hemp and you're deriving CBD out of that product in Uruguay or any other low-cost outdoor cultivation areas, yes, it makes complete sense. And yes, you can bring that product into Europe. But if you're talking about medical cannabis, and you're talking about high THC strains, then there's limitations on what can be done outdoors and what can be done indoors. And so I think it's very important to break up that distinction. Then further, recreational cannabis only confuses that, because then you can only cultivate recreational cannabis within country, and so there's those restrictions. And can you actually do that indoor and outdoor? Well, it really depends on what products you're trying to actually make out of them, and are you going to be able to meet the regulatory requirements for even recreational cannabis in those countries. So it's very, very important to just zoom out and really understand what I think on a global basis where we are today and what we know. It's CBD is certainly is where you can pretty much do anything you want outdoors. You won't be importing into Canada, unfortunately, until our regs change. But outside of Canada, trying to tackle the Australian market, the UK market, the European market, the Asian markets, yes, you could cultivate product anywhere outdoors and start to ship product that is CBD only. So I just wanted to add that additional kind of sort of a clarity around how we what terminology we use and how we actually talk about these things.
I think that's a really good point, Deepak. I think as someone that works in the Canadian, regulatory space, that sort of canonical definition of cannabis, including CBD, is something that just goes synonymously with the area. So, yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out.
Yeah, thank you. That was great, and it's a fair point. And last but not least, Lucas, could you just give us a brief description of the primary product categories in medical cannabis in Europe, just to compare with what we have right now in Canada?
Sure, and I'm sure Deepak will have a lot to add, but just as we've seen in the Canadian market, Ontario specifically, and across all the cannabis retail stores for recreational use across Canada, is dried flower as a leader, and probably will remain a leader for some time.
Yeah, I think the same thing on the European side. Certainly, flower is where everything is at. That's the majority of the market at the moment. But we are starting to see extracts really pick up. I think if you look at category growth, extracts has certainly got a lot of category growth within it. We've seen some Canadian licensed producers like Tilray do a really good job in Europe now with their extract products. So we're starting to see those products come onto the market. And I think as legislation evolves, it's only natural that these product formulations will start to change. We start to see it in Canada, but again, when you look at this from a medical perspective, you look at it from a GMP perspective, the writing's on the wall. It's only going to get better. I think that Germany has a lot of work to do around the way that it classifies what they call magisterial preparations, under which cannabis is currently regulated. So certainly a lot needs to change there. But I think for now, dried cannabis is where it's at. But I do see that evolving, and I do see additional product forms coming on stream. But not forgetting sort of stability. I think the other thing that, as Lucas mentioned at the top of the call, was stability is something that's probably the most ignored concept that comes into play generally. And when you're talking about stability on flower, that's one thing. Then you're talking about stability on actual pharmaceutical product formulations like capsules. It's very different. And I think that in Canada, again, we've taken for granted that you can just produce a product at your facility and put it on the market, because there's not very much you have to do in terms of stability or analyzing that product and putting an expiration date on it. So it's very easy to do it in Canada, but not so easy to do it on the international side of things.
We didn't get the chance to talk about some of the concerns around stability as well in the German market for Canadian exporters. I mean, exporting in Canada is very simple from the German importer side, but from Health Canada's side to grant those export permits, I mean, typically importers in Germany are looking at about 3 months, which can very well align with the length of stability for dried flower product as well. So another huge challenge there is how slow a lot of these export permits are being granted from our regulatory body here at home.
Perfect. Thank you. Do you have any final thoughts, just as we wrap up this discussion, maybe some advice to license holders that they are actually pursuing the EU GMP certification or thinking about it?
Yeah, speak to Lucas.
Start early. Start early. Understand what the market is, understand what the value and potential return on investment is, and make the decision. And maybe look to what your neighbors around have done. And there's a reason we've only got a handful of folks in Canada with that certification and designation. So move wisely, spend your dollars carefully.
That's a good advice. Very good advice. Thank you. Well, thank you both. I believe that was very enlightening. And if our guest wants to connect with you after this discussion, do you want to share your contact information, social media, LinkedIn, whatever you're using?
Yeah, we'll be sure to share those.
Start with, yeah.
We're at CAnnDelta.
Perfect.
So Instagram, Twitter.
Awesome.
You can find me on Twitter, Deepak Anand.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone attending as well. Remember to stay tuned in for our Q&A session right after, where you can ask Lucas and Deepak your questions. See you in a bit.